I do want to say welcome and thanks for coming, especially in the craziness of this semester and this time, like blocking this time out to be here, to take some time for something you don't exactly have to do, I think is just a great benefit to the academic community here. So hopefully benefit to all of you personally as well. We are the Center for Religion and Global Citizenry. One thing we do is this Interdisciplinary Religion Group. So we strive to be an informal working group of graduate students, faculty members, and now some community members whose interests involve the study of religion. Our hope is to provide a forum where participants can workshop the research in progress, discuss theoretical and practical issues involved in the academic study of religion, and also form connections across departments at UW-Madison. People who are interested in religion come from a variety of departmental backgrounds, so it's good to have something like that. This is our first meeting for the fall and for this academic year. We're hoping to have 3 meetings in the fall here. So tonight, September 23rd, in a month on October 21st, also a Wednesday, Vanessa Cook will be presenting on spiritual socialists, religion in the American left, on progressive religious activism from 1920 to 1980. So that will be our second talk. And then on December 2nd, also a Wednesday at the same time, Killian Harar, I said, mentioned Killian. His presentation is entitled Shifting Frontiers, Pilgrims, Protestants, and Revolutionaries in 18th Century Europe. So I'll hand it over to Ulrich at this point, the director, to introduce our speaker for today, Ben.
Yeah, welcome again. I welcome in particular Ben Shannon, a recent PhD of the history department. I had the honor to be on his committee. He defended this spring. Very nice, very exciting, very interesting dissertation. He writes on the politische Nachtgebet, the political evensong, which is kind of a nucleus, if you know a little bit about Germany and the German left and religious history in Germany, is a crucial point. Originally planned as an event at the Catholic Convention in Essen, Germany in 1968. They had to leave the Catholic Convention and then met in a Protestant church. The circle became an ecumenical circle, and they tried to define a political or explore a political liturgy in response or against the backdrop of the Vietnam War and all those events in the late 60s at the height of the student movement in Germany. There are some important post-war figures of West Germany in this circle. On the theological side, prominently Dorothee Sölle. And there was also Heinrich Böll, German author, involved. So some very prominent people, if you know a little bit about that history. So this is an exciting topic. A lot is going on. A lot of people meet here and move on from there. The student movement also develops in very different ways after this. That, of course, is something Ben will tell us about. Before I give Ben the floor, I want to say that we met first many years ago. It was one of my first seminars at UW-Madison, and I called that seminar Churches Under Hitler. It was kind of Weimar leading into 1933 Germany, and then some transatlantic explorations, the debates in the US. And he was there. He had just gotten to Madison, working with Rudi Kosher, and Rudi told him that he had to take that seminar. So we know each other for a long time. And again, I'm honored that he asked me to be on his committee. And I think it's a great dissertation, and looking forward to Ben giving us this talk now. And with everyone in the room, welcome, Ben.
All right, thank you very much, Uli, and thank you, David, and thank you everybody for showing up, and a big thanks to the IRG for inviting me. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to share my screen and give a PowerPoint presentation. Tried it earlier with David. It looked good. Hopefully it works. We all know technology can be kind of problematic. So let me just see. Okay, is this working? Can I get a thumbs up from people? Yes? Okay, awesome. So as Professor Rosenhagen said, I am presenting today about my dissertation research. My dissertation was actually called The Political Night Prayer and the Politicization of Religion in West Germany. What I'd like to do today is to talk about the kind of main problems that I was addressing in my dissertation, and then give a short breakdown of the political night prayer and its impact, its influence, the history of the political night prayer, because I think that it is something that, especially among an American audience, is almost unheard of, even though many of the members were important thinkers within Germany in the post-war era. So I'd like to talk about that history, and then at the end come up with some of the conclusions and the places that I plan to go with the research. So bear with me. The first couple of slides, or the first slide and the last slide, are a little bit text heavy. Like I said, bear with me. This picture that you're seeing right here is a picture of the political night prayer taking place in a church. Without the altar and cross in the background, you might have a hard time determining that this was actually a church, and that is part of the appeal of the political night prayer at the time. I may be coming back to this picture in a little bit. So let's talk first about the politicization of religion in West Germany during the 1960s. So when I say politicization of religion, it's actually a term that, in full disclosure, it is the tactic I took when I approached the subject, but if I were to do it again, I probably wouldn't use the term because it's a bit sticky and people don't automatically understand what you're talking about. I probably could have said something like democratization of religion, or some sort of maybe liberalization, some term like that. But it's one of those things when you're writing a dissertation, all of a sudden that deadline's showing up and it's way too late to change stuff. So it's like, all right, we're rolling with this. So as far as the definition for politicization of religion, in general, this is something that has occurred throughout history. It simply means an attempt to bring religion into the realm of politics, so to combine religion and politics. Within the context of West Germany in the post-war era, I'm specifically talking about a perceptible shift toward a socially critique, politically left-leaning form of Christianity that includes the institutional aspects of German Protestantism, but also exists outside of German Protestant institutions. The important thing for some people, especially church historians, is that some sort of politically active shift took place within German Protestantism. Most people put it at the 1960s, some push it up to the 1980s. Regardless, it takes place, and today you have a German Protestant church. And when I say Protestant, I mean, of course, there are multiple forms of Protestantism within Germany, but I'm talking in general. You have a situation where German Protestants are much more likely to protest something or state their opinion on something like the recent refugee crisis, or the political ramifications of the war in Iraq, for instance, in the early 2000s. These things were not always the case, and this shift takes place in the 1960s, possibly 1970s. In order to understand that kind of politicization of religion that takes place in West Germany, you have to gain some sort of understanding of the large historiographic arguments that are taking place about that process. What I have here listed is, of course, a bit essentialized. Things are, of course, more complicated when you get into the weeds of the discussions. But in general, here are some of the positions that I encountered as I approached the subject of the political night prayer. First of all, there is an idea that politicization was somehow a Marxist attack on Christianity, an attempt to infiltrate Christianity by Marxist ideology. So you've got Marxists coming in and attempting to somehow shift the focus of Christianity toward a Marxist goal of destroying capitalism. That was a much more prevalent idea in the 1960s than it is today, but it is still one of the kind of foundations of the idea of politicization here. Another idea is that Christians were passive in the politicization process, or they simply followed the Marxist lead. This is still very prevalent, the idea that Marxists were leading the show, they're the ones creating the ideas. Any Christians that were adopting the ideas were essentially just taking Marxism and not really contributing their own theological development to these Marxist ideas. There is a concept of Christians as useful stooges or useful idiots that were kind of naively following these Marxists as the Marxists attempted to destroy the Christian institutions. There is a belief that the intellectual foundation for politicization was laid by high intellectuals in something called the Christian-Marxist dialogue, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So hold on to that for a moment. The main point is that there's this concept that the intellectual foundations are taking place within these insular discussions among high intellectuals, and that no important developments occur after that Christian-Marxist dialogue breaks down in 1967-68. That's pretty much the end of that intellectual exchange of ideas. And then that the idea that politicization led directly to the weakening of Christian institutions and the secularization of society. This is a much larger argument, part of the secularization thesis that most of us are very well aware of, which has been kind of a zombie form of itself for the last, 50 years. It's constantly like, yes, secularization happened. No, it didn't. This goes all the way back to Max Weber. So these are some of the historiographic ideas that I encountered as I approached this subject. And at the end, I'll have a next, unfortunately, another text-heavy slide that talks about my findings and my challenges to these ideas that are within the historiography. My main point within this dissertation and within this presentation is to demonstrate how the political night prayer reveals aspects of the how and why of politicization of religion in West Germany. So the presentation is broken into 4 parts that kind of reflect the structure of my dissertation. The first is the translation of ideas that motivated the political night prayer and the people who were responsible for it as an event, the ideas that motivated them and how they translated into something tangible like the political night prayer. The impetus for the political night prayer comes with a general rethinking of religion in post-World War II Germany. You could have said post-World War II Europe. There are 2 important kind of branches of this. One is the Catholic Reform movement of the post-war era, which kind of culminates in the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, 1962 to 1965. And there are various reform efforts that are attempting to bring the Catholic Church into the modern era, as they said at the time. And so efforts to make the Catholic Church more democratic, to make it more conducive to the needs of the laity at the time. Within German Protestantism, there is also a reform movement. This is having to do largely with the relationship of German Protestantism with the Nazi past. The relationship of German Protestantism to the state is one with a long history stretching back all the way to Luther and Luther's relationship to the German states as protectors during the Reformation. This relationship, along with Luther's ideas of the two kingdoms, the idea that the kingdom of heaven is something that the church should be interested in, the saving of souls, that's something the church should be interested in. Earthly kingdoms are something the state should be taking care of, and never the twain should meet. So there's this tension in German Protestantism between staying out of the church's business and being kind of subservient to it as a protector. This leads to problems during the Nazi period, when you have a split in German Protestantism where the majority of the church becomes a tool of the Nazi regime, and a much smaller group resists in what is known as the confessing church. So this kind of split has ramifications in the post-war era, and there is a feeling among German Protestants that there has to be a way to avoid the kind of catastrophes that occurred under Nazism. There's got to be a way to avoid this in the future where the church can take a more active role. There was an idea among the most kind of radical German Protestants in the 1960s that Vietnam was kind of a new Auschwitz. Obviously a very offensive thought to people of maybe Jewish heritage, conflating the idea of Vietnam with the extermination of millions upon millions of Jews. But this was an idea of the concept that these kind of atrocities perpetuated by the state are continuing into the 1960s. So the main question that both German Catholics and German Protestants are trying to answer is, how do they create an expression of Christian faith that is capable of critiquing and correcting social and political injustices? To put this into to Marxist terms, how do you bridge the gap between theory and praxis? So how do you bridge the gap between your faith in Christian institutions, your faith in Christianity, and the gospel message, and then making that into a reality in a way that has real purchase in concrete terms, in concrete political terms that are going to prevent the kind of injustices we see in perpetuated with the Nazis. And of course, in the post-war era, there is a feeling of fear about the possibility of nuclear war, of the destruction of humankind through a conflict between the Soviets and the Americans. And so this is also weighing on the creators of the political night prayer. How do we create a form of Christianity that is active, that is able to influence and change politics? The answer for many of these Christian intellectuals is the Christian-Marxist dialogue and the concept of political theology. So I won't get into it in too much depth, but for a brief period in the mid-60s, Christians who were facing the problems I've just talked about, and Marxists who were also facing their own problems in the post-war era, problems having to do with Marxism, dogmatic Marxism being abandoned on the left in Western Europe, the problems of Soviet-style authoritarianism not matching up with their views of what Marxism should be. So both of these groups are entering crisis, and they enter into dialogue with one another to come up with some sort of solutions to overcome the problems facing them. One of the solutions that the Christian side comes up with, specifically Catholics, specifically Johann Baptist Metz, who has actually recently died, I believe earlier this year, was the idea of political theology. And all political theology means for the purposes of this presentation is the idea that faith, Christian faith, has political consequences. So Christian faith must be translated into political terms. If you believe that Christ said, love your neighbor, what does that mean in practice? So that is the kind of theory behind political theology. Faith has political consequences. So the founders of the political night prayer are all high intellectuals, as Uli mentioned, Dorothy Sola is a member of this group. She becomes one of the most famous Protestant theologians of the 20th century. You also have Heinrich Boll, you have Walter Dirks, Eugen Kogan. These are major figures in post-war thought. I wouldn't even say Christian thought, just in thought in general. So these are high intellectuals engaging in this Christian Marxist dialogue, but they do not want to keep their focus on simple dialogue. They want to take their ideas and, again, translate them into action. So the question becomes, how do we remove ourselves from this insular realm of intellectual dialogue and actually engage with people, create a new form of Christianity that is more conducive to political action? They find answers in the late 60s with the student movement and the extra-parliamentary opposition movement. So the student movement, probably well known by everyone here, but it is, at the time, it's using all of these tactics that are involving street demonstrations, involving information dissemination, large-scale production of paper goods, so flyers and booklets with information, political information, attempting to educate people. The political night prayer founders latch onto those aspects. They latch onto the aspect of a political event. And then, of course, you have the extra-parliamentary opposition movement, which is a wider collection of primarily leftist groups within Germany in the 1960s that are protesting certain measures that are intended to curb the development of communism, and which in practice would actually limit people's civil rights, essentially taking rights away in the event of a communist uprising. So this law was going to be passed, and a lot of people on the left joined together with the student movement and others to have these mass protests against the emergency laws. Now, the founders of the political night prayer, they look to the student movement and the extra-parliamentary opposition movement as for ideas on how to bring their message to the masses. And what they come up with is a worship service, what they call a political worship service. It has 4 parts, which are information. So the speakers would introduce information about a particular topic. For instance, the very first political night prayer was on the subject of Vietnam. So they talk about a subject, they offer meditation, and what this means is prayers for intercession, but also reinterpretations of Scripture. This is a very, very important part. Instead of taking these old interpretations that you might hear if you go to a Sunday church service, they were very particular about lifting material directly from the Scriptures and then applying it to the situations that they were facing at the time, the political situations. So just a very quick example, they take the scriptural passage in Matthew that talks about how dare you, talk about the speck in your brother's eye when you have a mote, a large stick hanging out of your eye. First take the stick from your eye, and then you can talk about you can criticize your brother. They applied that to the West critique of, authoritarianism in the USSR, and yet, according to the members of the political night prayer, the United States is committing atrocities in Vietnam. First, it needs to deal with its own authoritarian tendencies before they critique the Soviet Union. And so that was the kind of meditation, these reinterpretations of Scripture that were taking place in the night prayer. Then discussion, they wanted to have a democratic group. So it wasn't just the case where you would go to like a normal church service, the preacher talks at you, you leave. It's a one-way form of communication coming hierarchically down to you. the speakers at these worship services would give some information, and then at the end, the crowd would have an opportunity to discuss that information, to offer their feelings, their thoughts, and challenge the speakers if it came to that. So it is a democratic form of discussion. And then the most important part to them was action. So the information, meditation, and discussion should end in action. It should end in the people who have attended this service going out into the community and taking the things that they've learned and trying to change society, change politics, alter the course of injustices. So in every single service, it would end with specific, concrete ways that the people in attendance could go out and act in a political manner to change society. The first of these services takes place at the Catholic Convocation in Essen in 1968. This was a gathering place for members of the student movement, and you have a situation within a lot of the convocations, what would you say? The places where people would like give little presentations, and they're the official presentations, those places were empty. Outside, you have situations like this. In the larger areas, you've got people protesting, mainly protesting the hierarchical aspects of Catholicism, the recent prohibition on the birth control pill took place right before this, and so there was protests against that. Within that environment, the first political night prayer takes place. So again, this slide is about the translation of this idea of political theology into the actual event of the political night prayer service. The next transition is this movement from a single event to an institution. So the people who started the political night prayer were a pretty small group of individuals, a group of friends, both Catholic and Protestant, and they were intellectuals, like I said, high intellectuals who existed within this Catholic intellectual milieu that eventually involves Protestants within Cologne. And so these people are friends, they're of like mind, they're meeting to discuss political issues, to discuss issues, theological issues. When they come up with the political night prayer, they have been experimenting with other aspects of Christian action. And this is just one event within the series of other actions that they attempt. This one happens to be very, very successful, however. So they try to hold the event in public. They are just going to repeat the same event that they had in Essen a month earlier. They're not sure it's going to happen more than one time, but they throw it out there as an attempt. The Catholic Church reacts by banning the night prayer from taking place within a Catholic church. They were supposed to have it in a Catholic church, doesn't happen. It ends up taking place in a Protestant church. This actually contributes to the popularity of the event, because as you see down below here, I have a headline from the day that the church bans the political night prayer, and it says Cardinal Frings. So the cardinal in Cologne, he locks worshipers out. So this feeling like the church is being kind of intransigent or whatever, it's locking these worshipers out, and that fuels the curiosity in the night prayer, and tons of people show up. Over 1,000 people try to crowd into the Antoniiterkirche. It's a 300-seat medieval church that there's no way you can fit 1,000 people in there. So they're crammed in. I have this picture here so you can see how many people are absolutely shoved into this. It does not look like a church service at all. You've got microphones, you've got cameras, you've got young people sitting all around on the altar. It resembles a sit-in many ways. However, these are not Marxists that are leading this thing. These are Christians who are using Marxist principles to express their desire for an active form of Christianity. Protestant and Catholic leaders both reject the political night prayer as heretical. They don't like the way that they're reinterpreting scripture. The result of their attacks, and in fact, Joachim Beckmann, the president of the Evangelische Kirche im Rheinland, he ends up actually comparing the political night prayer to the Nazis and the way that the Nazis had brought fascist ideology into the church. He basically said, you're just doing the same thing, but you're bringing Marxist ideology into the church. The result of that is that it actually increases the popularity with a certain amount of the population. If you look at this picture, you'll actually see, you'll see some young people, but you will also see some older middle-class folks. This was primarily left-leaning folks, but there were people on the right that in the beginning wanted to see what was going on. So it was quite a popular event, well carried in the press, well covered, covered not just in Cologne, but all throughout West Germany. In response to these attacks, I should also say this. The church fixated on one particular person, and that's Dorothy Sola. You can see her picture down here in the press. She's the one that is getting interviewed by the press. She's the one who becomes the face of the political night prayer because she has a particularly I don't know how to say it in a neutral way, a particularly vitriolic response to institutional religion. And so she's the one that people really latch onto. She becomes the face of the political night prayer. One of the things I found out, however, and so when I started the project, I'm thinking, of course, she's the face of the night prayer. But as I got deeper into it, I found that actually was not the case. It was a much more diverse group of folks that were putting this thing together. But nevertheless, I have her pictured here in as the speaker at the first night prayer. In response to the criticisms of the Catholic and Protestant churches, the main theologians, so Sola and three other individuals within that group of leaders of the night prayer, they create this pamphlet called Political Night Prayer as Model. And they essentially present the night prayer as a new form of Christian worship, not something that's going to totally take the place of other forms of worship, but something that could be incorporated within the realm of Christian worship. They, within this response to Catholic and Protestant attacks, they create a number of guidelines and parameters of the political night prayer, which takes it from being just an event to an institution. So they say it's ecumenical, it's open to everyone, even non-Christians can show up. I have a question mark there because it becomes a point of contention later on. But in theory, it's open to anybody who wants to show up, Protestants, Catholics, even non-Christians. They define it as an experimental, evolving medium for exploring political theology. So it's something that they want to continue. They want to hold it once every month, which they do for the next 4 years. And within these services, they're not just going to focus on Vietnam or the democratization of the Catholic Church. They're going to focus on new topics each month. So in each political night prayer service, you will have new information, new meditations, new discussion, and new forms of action. And then they define the political night prayer as flexible. The content can be altered to address any number of injustices. So these are the kind of foundational principles of the night prayer that allow it to become an institution. And importantly, they would not have defined this institution without these attacks by the Catholic and Protestant churches and without the popular support from the public. So these two things combined to kind of force or motivate the creators of the night prayer, this group of about 10 to 20 people, it motivates them to create an institution out of this what had been a singular event. So the transition to institution carried a number of challenges with it. One of these was the fact that the Christian participants who formed the majority of those involved in the political night prayer, they came for different reasons. Some were particularly interested in reforming the Christian churches, Catholic Protestant churches, and institutions specifically. They were not, and when I say reforming the institutions, they wanted to create institutions that were more politically involved in critiquing society, involved in preventing injustices within institutional Christianity. You had others that were interested in personal spiritual renewal. So a lot of these people were interested in the theology of Johann Baptist Metz and of Dorothy Zola. They came because they were interested in the kind of theology that somebody like Zola was offering when she said that God is not the kind of Mr. Fix-It that you might have heard of in the theology that you studied at Sunday school. She said God is completely other, and that when you are, and not only is God other, but he's not going to fix things on earth. We've got to fix it ourselves. And when we fix things, when we address injustices, then human beings are communing with God. People who had been alienated from traditional forms of Christianity found that kind of idea of communing with God through political action, political activism. They found that very appealing. It helped to renew their Christian faith. So you have people who wanted to reform institutions, people who wanted to join for personal reasons, and then you had people who were very politically motivated, who were considered themselves Christian Marxists. So Christian first and foremost, but Marxist in their political leanings, and they believed that you could collapse the boundary between Christianity and Marxism to fold the Christian activism within a Marxist political platform. So these things are being held together initially within the night prayer, but they lead to tensions, inherent tensions between reformers and radicals. So you have a group that's very flexible and open to all kinds of people, but then of course you have people with different ideas that are coming in, and it does cause conflict. So the question for the institution becomes how to manage the influx of these new collaborators who all have different motivations and expectations and different theological views. How do you manage all of these people and still lead towards some sort of effective praxis, some sort of effective action? Their answer is to portray the political night prayer as a laboratory, to push toward a laboratory model of these services. So anyone, literally anyone with any interest, can collaborate in construction of a night prayer service. If you have a particular perspective, that will be reflected in the service. That was viewed as a good thing by some members of the night prayer, some of the leading members of the night prayer, because they thought this will help us to address everybody's concerns. So if you're interested in institutional reform, if you're interested in Marxist revolution, these things can be expressed within the same institution. So they viewed it as a plus, a positive, something very powerful about the political night prayer, its ability to reflect different views and to educate people on different injustices. And then the laboratory model allowed for testing of political theology. So you could, at the end, you would suggest various forms of action. If those forms of action were effective, you could pursue those. If they turned out to be ineffective, you would discard those. So again, an experimental testing ground for political theology. On the side here, I have these two pictures that kind of illustrate the challenges facing the political night prayer. The first picture, the one above, is a picture of a silent march that took place under the sponsorship of the people who go on to form the political night prayer. Many of them are in the front and center here. So you can see these are not young students. These are people in their 30s. Some are in their 40s. And these are people that are, they could be dressed to go to church right there. And their sign is a singular placard that just says, Golgotha is Vietnam. So conflating this kind of suffering in Vietnam with the kind of suffering and injustice that took place when Jesus Christ was crucified. Below, you see a silent march that took place 1 year later, after the political night prayer had gone viral, so to speak. And you can see there's multiple placards, multiple different people. You have young people, you have older people, and they have different, each one of these placards is basically saying something different, and it reflects the kind of amalgamation of different voices that you have. So from a movement that was kind of initially focused on these injustices in Vietnam to something that is blown wide open into all of these other political issues. So the final kind of stage in the life of the political night prayer is what you might say the flirtation with, or the involvement with, direct involvement with non-Christians in the New Left. So non-Christians in the New Left had always been a part of the political night prayer since the very beginning. Many had gone out of curiosity. Somebody like Sola and a couple other members, the leading members of the night prayer, were also part of the Republikanischer Club in Cologne, which was a place where Marxist intellectuals could meet and kind of discuss theory, and it was not an overtly Christian group, so they had ties outside of outside of the Christian circle of the political night prayer. They had direct ties to non-Christian Marxists. So these people were coming to the political night prayer from the very beginning. Some came out of a sense of novelty, that the political night prayer was a provocative, it was a provocative event that you would not normally find within the confines of a church. It's literally these ideas that are challenging the church. They are quite literally spatially infiltrating the church. They're going into the church with these protest actions. And this was a very attractive thing for Christians, but also these non-Christians in the left, because like I said, in the early, if you look at this first picture, you see all these young people sitting up at the front of the church. Again, you would never guess that this was a so-called worship service. If it weren't for the cross in the background, you'd think it was a sit-in. And so these kind of younger members of the student movement, they found the novelty of the political night prayer to be very attractive. There was also an element of outreach within the political night prayer. So the New Left realized that by cooperating with Christians in putting on these political night prayer services in conjunction with the Christian efforts, they could transmit their own messages to Christians who might not, like middle class church-going Christians who might not otherwise be exposed to Marxist ideas. They could be reached through something like the political night prayer. They wouldn't be comfortable going out on the street and protesting, but they might be comfortable sitting at a night prayer service. And then there was True Alliance. I did many interviews for this among both members of the former members of the political night prayer and members of the New Left who had cooperated with the members of the night prayer, maybe just did one or two worship services, who didn't consider themselves members of this night prayer group, but considered them allies. So they viewed, and these folks were like, they had no ill will toward these Christian folks in the night prayer. They really viewed them as independent allies. So these aren't people that they're trying to, co-opt, not people that they're trying to manipulate. They viewed them as allies in the same struggle. And then there were people who did attempt to co-opt the political night prayer, and this falls in line with what you might say is the dominant ideas in the early goings of the historiography, where you had Marxists who viewed this as an opportunity to push, to infiltrate the church, take control of this particular form of worship service, because it was very conducive to leftist ideas and also to outsiders coming in and manipulating it. And so there were some people who came in and did try to co-opt the service. But even these people that I talked to did not have any ill will toward the Christian members of the night prayer. They didn't feel like these were that these people were, useful idiots. They maybe didn't understand some of the spiritual aspects, but nonetheless, they still respected their efforts. So New Left involvement in the political night prayer, as the night prayer becomes more and more open. So about 6 months after the night prayer takes place in 1968, it becomes more and more open to these folks from the New Left. As they begin to work within the night prayer with these more convinced Christians, with some of the founders of the night prayer, the message begins to shift from that kind of Christian reform element that maybe was dominant in the beginning, that motivated many of, particularly the Catholics involved, but not just the Catholics. Also, I talked with some of the Protestant members, founding members, who absolutely believed that this institution was dedicated to Christian, the reform of Christian institutions. And so the message begins to shift as more and more members of the New Left, non-Christians, get in there. It becomes more radical, less conciliatory. The kind of kind of visual aspects of the political night prayer change, along with the more inflammatory remarks. There's a lot of adoption of New Left language. So talking about fascism, calling just about anybody who is a member of the hierarchy within the church is a fascist. Hierarchy of any institutions of authority become, fascist. There is a visual representation on the left here. I have one of the flyers for the political night prayer. It's political night prayer before the vote in 1969. So the all-important vote that shifts the power away from the Christian democratic government toward the Social Democrats. There was a political night prayer that takes place right before that, and it is specifically declaring the more right-leaning political parties within Germany to be essentially fascists, or to be co-opted by former Nazis. You see the use of the SS on this poster. This image of the policeman was actually taken from the student movement in France, in the Paris May of May '68. And the guy who did these posters, I ended up interviewing him, and he was one of the more left-leaning Christian members of the night prayer. He had grown up Catholic, and he ended up joining the night prayer as kind of the last gasp at a way to maintain his Christian identity, even though he was becoming highly politicized through Marxism. And so his placards were very provocative. There's one, I didn't include it, I actually have it up if I can show it. There was a night prayer service called Christmas, Christmas über alles, and it was like critiquing the consumerism of Christmas and kind of the capitalism of Christmas. And the placard had this little stick man like urinating on a fiery plastic Christmas tree with his fist in the air saying, "Smash the bourgeoisie." So it's like, these are pretty provocative visuals that are coming from a group that was not always this provocative. Within the discussion element of the night prayer, the Marxists become very critical of the efforts of the people who are running the show. They say, these are mainly bourgeois people in their 30s and 40s, and they're all talk and no action. All we're doing at these night prayer services is talk, and we're not actually getting anywhere. Your efforts at praxis are primarily, things that are like Christian charity, give money to certain groups, or prison reform, but not really getting at the structural elements of prison reform, still existing within some of these Christian charitable exercises of like visiting those people in prison and raising awareness of the conditions within prison. And so the Marxists were like, we're not really getting at the main issue, which is the structural problems involved in capitalist society. And the demand for addressing this structural problem was so strong that it began to create massive tensions, because of course, the people who founded the political night prayer are starting to feel, some of them were resentful because they were more interested in reform, but those who were more sympathetic to Marxism, people like Sola, they of course felt they had a terrible conscience about this, because they were, like, well, you have a point here. We are bourgeois people. We are intellectuals. Our biggest fear is that we're just talking and not doing anything. So they attempt to, and I realize I've only got about 10 minutes left. So we just have this slide and then one left. So we're almost there, folks. But these people within the night prayer who are sympathetic to Marxism, they get a bad conscience and they try to take one massive stab at actually doing something. And the result is an absolute disaster. They invite these kind of dyed-in-the-wool Marxists to talk about their efforts to mobilize homeless youth. So in the effort to find the new proletariat, Marxists at the time get really radical and are like, the homeless youths are one of the only group that is outside of capitalism that has yet to be co-opted. So we need to radicalize these people. And the problem of homeless youth at the time, there's all these kids that are running away, they're getting into drugs. And in the effort to kind of help these kids, the Marxists are trying to radicalize them, and the PN folks are trying to help them, and it becomes a terrible disaster. The PN folks rent a building that serves as a home for some of these kids. It becomes overflowing with hundreds of kids. These are people who have normal bourgeois careers, and now they're trying to take care of these kids. Some of them end up they take them into their homes, which becomes a total culture clash, because you've got kids coming off the street, just going into people's homes and kind of living there. I have a bunch of really kind of funny and also sad stories of how that was a disaster. Social services ends up getting involved in shutting the entire operation down, because you have, like somebody brings their 13-year-old girlfriend in this homeless shelter, and all kinds of problems happen: drug use, violence, things of that nature. Social services shut it down, and the PN is absolutely crestfallen by this, especially these members who are sympathetic to Marxism. So that becomes, in all the interviews, everybody said this was a turning point. After this, which is about November of 1970, there is a major division and fragmentation of the political night prayer. You have people who want to stick with reform, and then you have people who want to stick with collapsing the boundary between Christianity and Marxism. And really, it drives the political night prayer into the dirt. It absolutely fragments, and it loses that dynamism that it had in the beginning, when it was more open and flexible and incorporating all of these different people and all of their energies. This, in many ways, mirrors the division within the New Left at the time. That is not by chance, because the more New Left folks you had in there, the more radical New Left folks that exploit the flexibility and the openness of the PN, the more they are infiltrating and importing their issues within the New Left, which at this time was like, how do we achieve this structural change when the student movement has failed, when the extra parliamentary opposition movement has failed? All of this stuff ends up having a negative impact on the political night prayer and robs it of its energy. So my dissertation really focuses on the period from 1968 to this kind of dissolution this fragmentation in 1970. But the night prayer goes on for another 2 years, and it continues. Had I had more space and more time and had not been in grad school for over a decade at this point, I would have kept pushing on with another chapter or two, talking about the latter stages of the political night prayer. But for the purposes of my dissertation and of this talk, we'll leave it at how it ends, with many of the leading figures of the night prayer end up getting jobs in other places, the people who were holding it together and keeping it kind of balanced between the reformers and the radicals. The reformers, many of them leave, and even many of the radicals, many of the radicals leave, and you have Dorothea Zola is pretty much running the show by the end, and she, because she's very much influenced by the New Left, like the New Left, as it fails to institute its reforms on the European continent, it looks to the so-called Third World as the site of revolution. Zola does the same thing, and she dissolves the PN, and along with a bunch of other folks that are left over for the PN, she creates this international group called Christians for Socialism, which is intended to educate Christians all over the place and really fuel the Third World revolution. The irony of this is that Christians for Socialism, it fizzles very quickly because it is truly just all talk and no action. It's a bunch of intellectuals that get together and produce these 50, 60, 70-page pamphlets that are just a bear to read. It's all information and none of the kind of the vibrance of attending one of these services where you feel like you're a part of something and you get jazzed up and you're going to go out and change something. It's not the same with this Christians for Socialism group. They do a couple of meetings, meetings of the mind, where they have these conferences and they produce these pamphlets. It's a total disaster. So I should say that today the political night prayer still exists, and it is still an institution that is used. I mean, if you just Google it right now, you can find things about a political night prayer on Brexit, or a political night prayer on the situation with the refugee crisis, or any number of political night prayers that is still in use. But the monthly night prayer services end in '72 with the dissolution, and it just becomes something that occurs occasionally, and it does occur at Protestant convocations in Germany on a semi-regular basis as well. They usually have a political night prayer there. So the last slide, I just want to go through some of the conclusions that I came to, and then I'll wrap it up and take questions. So one of the main, and again, this is text heavy. I mainly did that so that when this goes up online, if somebody wants to look through these, they'll have it. They can just quickly glance at some of the conclusions I came to. So the intellectual foundation for the politicization of religion was created through active experimentation in political theology, not simply through insular debates of the Christian-Marxist dialogue. So that initial push to figure out, okay, so how do we have a politically active form of Christianity? That started with the Christian-Marxist dialogue, but without something like the political night prayer to implement those ideas, you wouldn't have the evolution of ideas from something like the Christian-Marxist dialogue to something like Christians for Socialism. You wouldn't have the development of the ideas of some of the moderate members of the Christian or the political night prayer, which I did not talk about in this presentation, but which are nonetheless very interesting and important. So the many attempts to bridge the gap between faith and action, which took place in the political night prayer, helped to shape the ideas about the appropriate relationship between politics and religion. It helped to normalize those ideas in a way and spread them to the public. So this is happening outside of institutional Christianity. One of the interesting things I'd like to talk with Brandon Block after this about is I believe his work looks at the institutional aspects of some of these changes that are taking place within German Protestantism, and I very much focus on the things that are going on outside of those institutions, both very, very important. The politicization of religion was not simply a Marxist infiltration of or assault on Christianity. Of course, there were some Marxists who did take that route, but when I was looking at this subject, I just discovered a multiplicity of motivations by Marxists and Christians, a multiplicity of reasons why they sought the politicization of religion. And then Christians were not passive in this process, nor were they merely useful idiots in some sort of Marxist master plan. They had agency, real true agency in this. Some looked to the New Left more than others, but there is a process of Christians attempting to form these ideas on their own and in cooperation with Marxists, but definitely an active agency here. And then the politicization of religion did not intentionally hasten secularization. I say intentionally because there were people within the night prayer who, when this split happened, for instance, the guy who did the flyer I showed you, he ends up actually leaving Christianity altogether. The ineffectiveness of the night prayer, especially in that etage situation with the homeless youth, that's the last straw for him. He leaves and he abandons Christianity completely. He's an atheist to this day. But only some people abandoned Christianity. Many others within the night prayer are still Christian to this day. Some, the night prayer offered them a means of maintaining their Christian spirituality. And so it's not a simple tale of linear secularization. The encounter between Christians and Marxists actually facilitates a rethinking of religion, not an abandonment of religion. And then much more specific to the historiography of the political night prayer, and something that I did not emphasize in this particular presentation, but Dorothy Zola was not the leader of the political night prayer. She was a leading voice and became kind of by a de facto leader of the political night prayer, but this was not her sole creation by any means. It was a collaborative effort by Christians from both the Catholic and Protestant faiths coming together with different ideas of reform or more radical ideas of reshaping society, coming together, not just Sola imposing her particular theology on the political night prayer. So that is all I have for my presentation, and I would love to answer questions that anybody has on the project.
Thanks, Ben. Really,
Thank you.
Yeah, this is fairly new territory, like you said. That I think when the topic was introduced to me, I was like, oh yeah, I don't think I know anything about this movement, which obviously had such a big impact in Germany. So just to kind of kick things off, I am curious how you personally became invested in this project. What was the hook for you?
I probably shouldn't say this because this is being recorded, so I have to be diplomatic here. But I came to this university doing a totally different topic, but my advisor was interested in political theology, and maybe said, you should do something on Rudolf Bultmann. And I started reading Bultmann's theology and was bored to tears and wanted to curl up and die. And so I saw a small pamphlet called Political Theology, A Conversation with Rudolf Bultmann. And it happened to be written by Sola. And within that was her theology that arrived out of the political night prayer. And so she developed it during her experience in the political night prayer. Again, I did not talk about that in this particular presentation, but I do talk about that development within my dissertation. And so I came to it through Sola, and a little note that she had in the foreword that said, I couldn't have come up with this stuff without my experience in this group, the political night prayer. So I thought, what is this thing? And it evolved from there. And I ended up just getting deep into the weeds of what this group was, and realizing that its tendrils extended to all of these different topics. And it became very, very difficult to narrow it down to what I was going to do in my dissertation, because I just kept going and going. Another reason why it took me over a decade to finish this project, because I kept going back for more and more research. 5 years in a row, I went back to do research because I found that there were so many things that this topic touched on. And so I was incredibly, incredibly interested in I'm not interested in Bultmann so much, but interested in how, this topic of political theology was translated through kind of these theological principles into this action-oriented organization. Totally by chance.
You're muted, Carl, if you were going to ask a question.
Carl, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, actually 2 questions.
Sure.
Left and right. During this period, the GDR had an established Protestant church. And moreover, there were established Protestant churches in the Communist East. So, for example, Josef Hromadka had the chair at Charles University in Prague. Any communication or interaction between East German communist Protestants and this movement, and let me ask my then follow up, goes them both. Political theology is also typically associated with the right. Carl Schmitt.
Absolutely.
Our political ideas are secularized theological ideas. Here you have now, so there's a political theology on the right somewhere, but now you have it also on the left. Anyway, so two questions.
Yes, so I'm just writing down your second so that I remember it.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, there are members of the Eastern Christian community that are taking part in the Christian-Marxist dialogue, but this is not influencing the political night prayer as much because the Christian-Marxist dialogue and that kind of exchange, both physical and intellectual, begins to face some real challenges in with the Soviet crackdown following the Prague Spring, and the ability of these exchanges to continue to take place. So the conferences were actually taking place in both East and West, on both sides of the divide, and I believe there actually was a meeting of the Christian-Marxist dialogue in the former Czechoslovakia. Do not quote me on that, but I believe that there was. But these things begin to fall apart as that dialogue falls apart. And so, quite frankly, Eastern Protestants are not as directly involved in this movement because it grows after that dialogue, the direct dialogue has begun to fizzle. And then the second question is, yes, and in fact, I mean, there's so many things that this is good practice for talking about this topic in public because, of course, political theology is well known as a 20th century theory of the right, with Carl Schmitt, as you discussed, the idea of secularized politics being secularized religious concepts, and in the idea of the sovereign, which of course has implications with Carl Schmitt's interest in and engagement with Nazism. However, there is an effort with this term to kind of rehabilitate it by the people that I'm talking about. So Johann Baptist Metz is very conscious of the idea that political theology has been used by Schmitt, but he is trying to rehabilitate it and transform the meaning into something more positive, something more democratic, something that can be used to positively transform politics in line with the kind of morality that is coming out of the gospel. So a very conscious effort to reform and rehabilitate the idea of political theology. Yeah, Brandon, I see your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I don't see a hand raise function. So this is really fascinating stuff, and we should find another time to talk more. But
yeah, absolutely.
A couple of questions that come to mind. I mean, one question would have to do with if you could elaborate a little bit more on the kind of wider ramifications beyond 72. So if you did have time to do that other chapter of your dissertation, does this, to what extent do you see this kind of feeding into later, social movements that involve Christians in West Germany? My question goes more to the earlier part. So you mentioned that you see the political might prayer as somehow emerging out of the kind of division of the church during the Nazi period. This reflects the legacy of some kind of, the confessing church and resistance groups and that sort of thing. But I'm wondering to what extent this political night prayer is involved with the development of a more kind of critical historiography of Christians during the Nazi past, or if it actually kind of extends this sort of resistance hagiography, right? Because, you know, obviously the view that comes out of more recent historiography is that even, you know, this church and this sort of, you know, so-called resistance organizations actually were quite accommodating to the Nazi regime after all. So do you see the political night prayer as being, you know, part of that at all, or are they kind of, you know, contributing to this kind of myth of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Christian resistance to Nazism and so forth?
Yeah, great questions. Those are fantastic questions. And I'll take actually the second one first. Interestingly, the members of the political night prayer, they are building upon aspects, especially the Protestant members, they're building upon aspects of the confessing church, the Barmen Declaration, and yet they're incredibly critical of the confessing church. So they challenge the idea that the church was this bastion of resistance. Somebody, especially like Sola, is incredibly critical and talk about the so-called resistance. So in fact, these people are challenging that kind of the kind of narrative that comes out immediately post-war, that, you know, the church is the one thing that wasn't touched or something like that. There's like some pure element within German society that we can focus on rebuilding, you know, Germany, because we've got these like German church folk who were resisting. So they do challenge that notion, absolutely. And there is open conflict between members of the confessing church and the political night prayer. Like I brought up Joachim Beckmann, important member of the confessing church, and he straight up goes to war with these members of the political night prayer because he believes that they are repeating the same mistakes of politicizing Christianity, just coming from the left this time. And so there is, without question, tension between the confessing church and the Protestant members of the political night prayer, even though they're building upon aspects of the confessing church, theologically speaking, the break with that kind of subservient form of Protestantism that is like stereotypical. And then I would say that the ramifications, I should have gone into that more in this particular presentation, but you have most directly members of the political night prayer leading efforts in the, again, outside of Christian institutions, but leading Christian efforts to oppose things like, in the Second Peace Movement in the 1980s, oppose the placement of nuclear arms within Germany. You have somebody like Sola, Marie Feit, people who are absolutely integral to the political night prayer, being arrested, taking part in, these sit-ins at nuclear sites. And they, in interviewing some of these folks, they were like, it was like a reunion, even of folks from the political night prayer who are leading these efforts in the Second Peace Movement. And so, without question, there are connections to these extra institutional efforts in the 1980s, especially. The 70s are a bit dormant, but in the 1980s you see a resurgence, because in the 1970s there's a bit of an attempt to still, among the hardcore folks, to like still squeeze out whatever they can from this relationship with Marxism, and it's more of a publication battle, but there are true physical ramifications that take place in the 80s. And then of course there are, and I'm not the first person to say this by any means, and it's one of the reasons why I didn't focus on it much in my dissertation. It would have taken me in a different direction, but there are people who were involved in the resistance efforts in the fall of 1989 in East Germany, who looked to aspects of the political worship service that were taking place in the political night prayer, looked directly to that as inspiration for how they carried out their own politically active forms of resistance in these worship services that became so famous as gathering points for protest in the latter stages of East Germany. So those are just two of the ways that I would say that are pretty important and significant long-term ramifications. Okay, anyone else? I know I went a little bit long, but
I don't know. Oh, can you hear me? Sorry about that. So thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. One thing that really stuck out to me was this formulation of the services as a laboratory of sorts, and how this was sort of like a compromise that they took to help navigate these political and theological, or the tensions between a political and theological focus. But I'm wondering if you found that this modality of a laboratory was understood as a form of worship, and how that if it helped not just resolve sort of like the interpersonal tensions of these different organizers, but also those more abstract conceptual tensions between politics, between a political focus and a theological focus, like particularly focusing on that modality.
Yes, that is such a great question, and it's something that, okay, so there are so many problems with this project, and there are tons of problems when it comes to terminology. And so, again, like I said, I would go back and not discuss the politicization of religion so much, because it feels a bit abstract to people, and be more direct about maybe democratization or something like that. The term worship service has been a sticking point for some people who read my dissertation. In particular, one of the members of the department, Lee Wandel, who focuses on the Reformation, was like, yeah, this is not a worship service. I'm sorry. Because it doesn't have any sort of aspects of traditional worship that she said would be recognizable. However, there were efforts to specify how this was a worship service, and it again evolved within the context of this receiving critique and responding to critique. The leaders of the Catholic Protestant churches are saying this is not a worship service, and then this motivates the PN folks to be like, no, this is a worship service. We are saying the Lord's Prayer was often said at these events. Communion, Eucharist was not administered, but there were aspects of recognizable Christian worship that are taking place here. So there would be mixtures of older hymns and hymns that were manipulated to maybe change the lyrics for a modern purpose. So this idea of navigating the elements of the political night prayer that are worship versus political, it is a very sticky situation that caused tension at the time. People, finally, one of the reasons why the night prayer ends up dissolving is also the place where they held these services. The Presbyterium that was in control of allowing the night prayer to continue finally said, listen, this is, the political aspects are overtaking this. By the end, when you have a lot of the more reform-oriented people leaving for various reasons, you're left with these radicals who are more interested in kind of parroting political ideas and less interested in the initial worship service aspects. And then this Presbyterian's like, listen, you guys can't keep doing this because we're losing the Christian elements. It becomes Christian in name only. And so this is something I would definitely like to explore more. However, I find that I start getting into territory that is incredibly boring to me when I get involved in liturgical aspects of what was going on here. Mainly, one, because I'm not interested in it. I'm more of a historian. I'm not particularly motivated by religious reasons, where I find that people who have been studying this from the aspect of German scholarship, there's no historians that are doing this. It's all people who are church historians or motivated by their inspiration from the liturgical elements of what's going on here. And that stuff is just not, I'm more interested in the Christian-Marxist dialogue and what happened here as a historical event rather than its implications for specifically church history. I hope that wasn't, I hope I answered your question. That was kind of like a roundabout way of doing that. But yeah, there's all kinds of problems with declaring this thing a worship service, but I do think I went with it. Yes, I believe it's some sort of worship service, weirdly. Anybody else? I know that we're probably running low on time here. Adam, was that a hand up?
Yeah, maybe I'll make mine a comment so that we can get Uli, I think, has a question too. First, I want to say thank you for a fantastic talk. I am not a German historian. I'm not doing 20th century stuff right now, but I loved it. And I'm also really glad that the center is recording it, because I teach a course and I'm doing it this semester on the history of radical and experimental education. And I can't wait to bring your talk in as a recommended extra for that week when we get to that stuff. I also do a course on the history of higher education, which includes student movements. Yeah. So it hits 2 home runs for me. Thank you. I love it. So my question, and I guess, maybe I'll just make it a comment so we can get Uli in, kind of piggybacks on something Megan was talking about. I'm interested in their evolving understanding of praxis.
Yes.
Because at the beginning, it seems like an event itself counts. And at the end, it seems like that's not enough. And so along the way, you know, there are various forms of praxis that one could point to, including art itself, that seems to be attached to the movement and the political night prayer. So all the way to eventually the disaster of housing the homeless children. So how would you assess, I keep making it a question, but I'm interested in that aspect of the project, how their ideas of praxis somehow evolve over time, and what started off as adequate or sufficient is at various points deemed inadequate or insufficient in the Christian-Marxist dialogue. I'll leave it there.
Yes, that is a fantastic question, and one that I tackle in the dissertation. So it does evolve. The idea of praxis does evolve. And again, you're dealing in the beginning with these people who are mainly in their 30s, some in their 40s, they're bourgeois, they're intellectuals. Their idea of what praxis means is primarily limited, their horizon is limited to institutional Christianity, things that they're comfortable with, writing letters, you know, like trying to get people to talk about Vietnam in church groups and things like that. And that constitutes praxis for them. At one point, they have a little like information session outside of the church because they're not allowed into it. And they just stand on a box and, you know, like talk about Vietnam. And that's considered praxis. The PN service at one point is considered praxis because, quite frankly, it is. It is a form of action. And that is enough in the beginning because they feel pretty darn good. They've got all of these people showing up. It's incredibly popular. And that in the beginning feels like they're motivating people, they're changing minds. You know, we hit a home run. But as the ultimate goal is still to create a form of Christianity that is politically engaged and changing society in tangible ways. I mean, this is an era when people had ideas that were just like, you know, the sky's the limit. And so we're on the precipice of revolution. We're going to change this whole society. And the fact they could not achieve that through the PN became more and more of a burden, especially when you had non-Christian Marxists who are holding themselves to that standard. And they're unable to do this with the student movement, and then imposing those standards on just these people who are like, hey, man, we thought we were doing pretty good. And so that it's an evolving understanding of praxis, which becomes incredibly problematic and divisive. Awesome. So Uli, did you have a question?
A comment and a question. So the comment is that if you will, the central problem is how to or what made it basically dissolve as a movement at some point is that the attempt to institutionalize something anti-institutional
yes
failed at some point.
Yes.
So you cannot, so the idea is to reform the church, and you know, Sölle's theology a little bit. It's this constant critique of the institution. But this, of course, takes place within the institution of the church.
Yes.
And she becomes one of the most important theological figures on the Kirchentags movement. So on those, so every other year in all of Germany, one city hosts the Kirchentag, and then thousands, 100,000, I'm not kidding, 250,000 is a good number for all these meetings. People flock from outside, and she's one of the most popular speakers on these Kirchentagen. But that, of course, is organized by the institution.
Yes.
So that's the comment. And I'm reminded of Habermas, who, when the student movement gets very radical, he criticizes the student movement. He criticizes his own students. Then he calls it social fascism. So, but it's this where the student movement moves outside of the institution, whereas on the religious side, on the Protestant side, it stays within the institution. However, that is also kind of foreshadowing the end of the political night prayer.
Yes.
And then, so that's the comment a little bit, kind of thinking of the context. But here's the question. I still haven't figured out, even after this great talk and kind of reminding me of all sorts of things, and I'm asking a little bit in the veins of Megan and Adam here, why was it so powerful? What's working here, and what's working in what you think is very well, boring or not so interesting? Why is this in the format, or Megan said, modality of a prayer, of a worship service? What's the language? What's something we cannot account for in a political conversation or discussion? Or what's how is it that we all of a sudden have 1,000 people? Yeah, I mean, you showed these great images, 1,000 people, young people in the middle of a church, and having something which, against Lee Wandel, I would consider a form of worship. Yeah, what's so powerful in this?
Yes.
Yeah, what makes the political night prayer a crucial moment from 1968 on, where people meet and really draw on for their own inspiration and motivation then in reforming Germany. And of course, you mentioned it's also, and maybe you can talk to that a little bit more, it's also a bit of a conflict between generations.
Oh, yeah.
So Beckmann was, of course, member of the Confessing Church, and he was the one who said that, who sharply criticized Sölle and the movement. But even as the presiding bishop, the praeses of the church was unable to disinvite them. So he, it's the local church, as I say, who can preach and who can be in the service in the church, and not the praeses, not the presiding bishop. But so it's a generational conflict also, which maybe is some additional aspect here to consider. But my question really is, why do you think, after looking at all these materials, having all these interviews, why is it such a powerful movement at this moment in time?
Okay, so I'll answer this. I want to make a comment to your comment, and then quickly answer, or quickly comment to your comment, and then answer your question. So my comment is that the institutional, there's a conflict here within the political night prayer because they're against institutions. They want to be able to be outside of institutions so that they can critique. And once they become institutionalized, they feel that they lose that critical distance. And then, ironically, they end up becoming an institution themselves. The political night prayer itself becomes a form of institution, a monthly institution. And so there's a big debate and struggle with that within the group. So that was my comment to your comment. The second thing is, why was it so powerful? That is a tough question to ask or answer. And in some ways, I think I could give you an overly simplistic answer, which is, I think that the flexibility, first of all, I think it tapped into something. I think it tapped into something politically with the moment. So this is occurring at this high point in the student movement. The student movement, the SDS student movement begins to go downhill shortly after the initial stage of the political night prayer. The APO, the extra parliamentary opposition, has already failed, but that feeling of connectedness, of cooperation that fueled the extra parliamentary opposition is still in place in October of 1968, enough that people, and I will say this too, that the flexibility of the political night prayer to offer people not only a mouthpiece for their views, but it's kind of like, because it doesn't specify the parameters of praxis, it becomes an all things to all people in a way. You can project what is it that you want to this institute to or this institution to produce in terms of praxis, and various groups then try to manipulate the political night prayer in order to produce the thing that they want from it. So for those reasons, it's popular. But I think what you're getting at, or maybe you're getting at, is that there's something even deeper at play here that is, I think, difficult to analyze in an objective sense, and that is the kind of feeling that people got when they were involved in the political night prayer. So through my interviews, I was able to hear people's experiences there and the kind of energy that they felt was in the room that they didn't get from a normal worship service on Sunday. You know, basically it was a feeling of maybe what Freud would have called the oceanic feeling. I don't know, something that you feel as if you're a part of something. And this was a very electric environment in the beginning of the night prayer. And so it's offering something that the normal church cannot offer you. And I think that's maybe a cop-out answer, but I believe that did play a role. So it's not just, you know, the political aspect, but that plays a part. It's not just the spiritual aspect, but that plays a part. I think it was one of these moments that it just encapsulated. It blew up at the right time as the right mechanism for that particular moment. And then Killian, I didn't see, I saw that something popped up here, but and I'll see if I can. Yes, right on. Okay, did you?
Yeah, I mean, you don't, no pressure to respond. I know we're way over time, so I just wanted to type that, maybe something for you to check out if you read French. It just resonated a lot. Thanks for this great talk.
And also, please shoot me an email as well. If I don't know if I'll be able to access this afterward. So shoot me an email for sure.
Yeah, will do. I'll send you the bibliographical reference.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, like Killian said, we're no longer pushing here. We're now kind of, you know, steam ahead.
Can I have one little side note? I'm also called here now. I have family duty, but because it's on my mind. So we mentioned Milan Machovich earlier as a Marxist counterpart for these conversations.
Yes.
He, of course, lost his position after the Russian tanks moved into Prague. The Russians crushed the Spring of Prague,
Yep.
And he had a very, I mean, he lost everything. He was a professor of philosophy, and I only know this because he apparently died recently.
Yes.
And so that's just as a side note. So.
And a big figure in the Christian-Marxist dialogue, huge figure.
Awesome. Well, that'll be the last word here. Ben, thank you so much for, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was great.
I'll give you some credit there. Yeah, next month, Venice's presentation will kind of, I'm anticipating a lot of mirroring themes. Religious left in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, please feel free to follow up with Ben by email with us. We're going to be posting this online. We'll give you a link. So if you'd like to share it with anybody, Adam, I know you said you might want to share it with your students. It's fantastic. So yeah, from the center, from all of us, thank you for being here. We'll see you again soon, hopefully. So
thanks so much. Take care.
Yeah, take care, Brennan. Everybody.
Thanks, Ben, again. I have to